Welcome to episode 702 of Salsidoparanormal. And tonight we are talking more about bridges. As usual, when I do these shows with conversations and based on topics, I'm going to skip the usual list of all the links you can find because you can find them on every episode description. So thank you all for being here and supporting the show and getting it to this point. And I appreciate all your support. So the previous episode, we started talking about bridges, and that's where we're going to continue with this episode. So, and of course, as in the previous episode, I'm happy to have a guest on with me. And so whenever you're ready, Jen, thank you for being here, and you're welcome to unmute.
Well, thank you for having me, James. I'm having a good time talking about the bridges, and it's a good time.
Yeah, it's just it's amazing how these things come up in from previous conversations about other things, but they all seem to connect in different ways. We still need to do a couple of shows about caves as well, underground things, but also probably we should do a show about water and rivers and creeks and all those things too at some point, or a couple of shows.
Yeah. The bridge thing, another thing I thought of while we were on the break a little bit between the two shows, two parts of the same show, but of the same idea. So it wasn't always over water that I've had strange things happen with the bridge. Years ago, I lived in a city, and I oftentimes would go with a friend of mine, and we would go sit at this bridge, and underneath it was just the highway would go underneath, and this was a railroad bridge. So it was to allow the railroad, and it was still active, and the trains would go over the top of this bridge, and below it were probably, I guess it was a 4-lane highway, that was going underneath it. And there were the lights that were over it still, and you could see the bridge perfectly, but it was behind this gas station. And so the house that my friend lived in was on one side of this hill, and you would cross over those railroad tracks and go over the other side, and I lived on the other side. And we would oftentimes go up there and just kind of sit and watch the cars and everything and just kind of sit there. And on one of those occasions, and it was so crazy and incredible, but that's where I saw one of the cryptids. Pretty much the only, besides any kind of ghosts or anything like that, one of the only cryptids I ever seen in my life was at that bridge. And we were up there sitting and watched. We were on the bridge, but saw this creature come up one side. So there were woods on either side of this. So it was kind of outside of the city. And out of the woods came up this cryptid that I can only describe as like a goblin. And I've talked about it before. You've heard about this. But it was crossing over the railroad tracks while we were on the bridge when we saw that instance. So that's really strange to have another bridge incident, but it had nothing to do with water. It was just the fact that there seemed to be something with either the railroad track or perhaps it was something to do with the bridge. Ironically, because we were on the bridge when we saw this, what I could only describe as like a typical folktale goblin. Looked exactly like that, and it was probably 4.5 feet tall. Very, the skin was like a translucent silvery gray, like almost like a shark skin or something. It was like, but it was silvery. You could almost see it looked like in the light when it was coming up underneath this one of the poles with the lights that were hanging over. You could see it, and it would look almost like Gollum, honestly, from Lord of the Rings. It looked much like that.
Yeah, that's wild. I do remember you talking about that a little bit over on Troubled Minds. That's the first time I heard that you talk about that, and that is amazing. That's why I think there is something to all the folklore, because these are all these different creatures, goblins and all these beings, fae and everything. They've been talked about for so long. It's not like it's all just in the past or in the present. It's both. It's throughout time, and that always amazes me. And it doesn't make sense to me why all that can't be here when it's been reported before and just talked about so much in the past. And so that is amazing. I do wonder if it has also to do with I don't know if gravity could be, and just the amount of energy that's in open spaces be above and below the bridges. If those are factors in some of these experiences people have, just the different I don't know effects that it can have on people and their minds and their energy and everything, and just everything that's around them as well. I don't know. I wonder if that's a factor.
Almost like a magnetic effect. So if you have a lot of, whether it's water or in this case, the other case I'm talking about right now, was road traffic, a lot of movement going underneath it.
Right.
And then on top of it, going over that, another, movement, whether it was with the train or people going across it or whatever. Yeah, maybe there is something to that. You have Mothman. You know how Mothman had to do with I think it was called the Silver Bridge. I can't remember right now, but you might remember better than I do with that. And then we have the most accounts recently too of bridges. People are talking about, these kind of attacks on bridges. Nobody knows, or it seemed that way, or these accidents with bridges. But just these Mothman in particular, I think that bridge was going over water. But the movement going underneath it and then the movement going over the bridge, maybe there is something to do with the energy flux of it, in a way. Could be.
Yeah, and it was the Silver Bridge, I'm pretty sure, with that. I'll be reviewing those books at some point as well too. The Mothman Prophecies and a couple of Keel's other books, and I'll be doing that as well at some point here soon. But yeah, I do wonder about that because even just my own experiences walking from a room with like a that's wide open to like a hallway, there's a different feeling. The air is moving around in different ways, and or not moving around in different ways. And I've just noticed. I did some for those that don't know, I'm legally blind, and I've gone through training in how to get around over the years because of my low vision. And some of that training has included doing just walking around, not much, but just here and there, but walking around with a blindfold on with my instructor, with an instructor there present. And I can confirm whenever we went to this stadium, it was like a hockey stadium, and I could feel the difference between walking through the hallway and then walking into the big open space of the stadium itself, just briefly. I didn't see anything because I had the blindfold on, but I could feel the difference in the way the air was moving and the sound was moving. So I think there could be something to that with energy and electromagnetism and all those things. And then like you mentioned, the railroad tracks over bridges or through bridges, that's all metal. And so who knows what could be going on there.
Yeah, the electromagnetic field of it, or at least like the sensation of energy going continuously one way or the other. It does make a lot of sense. I mean, like just the repetitive movement of people and going over any different, like even roads and things like that. Like you have the idea of haunted roads and back roads. Maybe we'll cover that sometime. Hopefully, because the idea even of that like people constantly transiting over these particular locations over and over and over again in motor vehicles. And you have the idea of even like ghost cars where people see cars that are not there, and the idea of people crossing the roads and things like that there's this constant movement there. And there could be like, it's haunted roads, haunted bridges, but it's a lot to do with where people are. But even some of these remote bridges, the concept of these bridges being in locations where people haven't been in a long time, like even the Sleepy Hollow concept of the covered bridge, and that being some type of location where they would encounter the headless horseman in the story of like Irving and Sleepy Hollow. It's the sort of idea of it guarding the bridge and not allowing passage to the other side. But that's the same thing with the troll concept that a person has to there's something guarding that, and maybe it's just some kind of territorial thing with that creature. There's a possibility there could be something with these cryptids. I don't like the term cryptids necessarily, but I don't know what else to call it. Like when these entities do decide that they're going to kind of hang around these certain locations, it could take up a sort of protectiveness or a guardianship of it, the same way that like a dog will guard a certain boundary or a certain property, that sort of thing, where it seems that they are associated with it because they've claimed it for some particular reason, because they've noticed that it's a location that people frequent or they encounter interaction there. And so I think there's some type of an advantage to that for the creature. And the fact that when you're on the bridge in between those two locations, you're at a sort of disadvantage in between those two places. So if you're going from one to the other, there's this sort of vulnerability about being on the bridge rather than on one side or the other. You're in between. You see it?
So yeah, I do. And I mean, even just we don't know for sure how long any of these beings, these creatures or whatever, have lived in certain areas or existed in certain areas. It could be that some have maybe lived in these areas before there were bridges, or and they're sort of, it's their homes, especially maybe with running water sources. Makes sense if you need any kind of water at all, or even the energy generated by water, that you would want to sort of be near these bridges, and of course take advantage of whatever else comes along with those bridges being there. And if you're maybe not, I don't know, if you're more of like a negative kind of, or if you're perceived as that a negative being that does use energy from other beings, people or whatever, then it makes sense that you'd want to protect your home and use it to your advantage however you want to.
But yeah, like the idea of like letting some people pass or something of the effect. Like I've heard about that before, like when going in through gateways. So maybe the bridge as a type of portal, a literal, it's in itself a type of gate, because if you don't have that bridge, you probably can't cross easily from one side to the other. Like in the case of that train track, the train could not carry its cargo from one side to the other, and so the bridge was necessary. And it was due to that there's maybe a lot of focus, and perhaps these creatures don't know what the focus is per se, but they can see that for some reason, why ever they are interacting with human beings, but they see the bridge as something that this is valuable to you, and you can't get from one side to the other without this bridge, and so I'm guarding it. It's just some kind of strange, I mean, it could be something as bizarre as that, but there could be a sort of ownership over that, like, well, I'll take up habitation underneath it, kind of the Billy Goat's Gruff concept of the troll underneath it, that sort of thing, letting some through and others not. But there's always this idea of like the toll and things like that, almost like a ferryman. Like, okay, you can go to the other side. I can see that's important to you. And if you want to go, the task thing is really strange too. I've heard stories about them encountering certain individuals or encountering these creatures or supernatural beings, that they have sort of a task or a toll before they will allow. Even how minor the reason for crossing the bridge might be. It may simply be, it could be in the case in the previous episode about how the farmer who owned the land that I lived on had simply built the bridge to connect two properties, but because he had built it badly, it resulted in the death of several people. But in another case, and therefore it may have become haunted because they trust, it was unseen that there would be a problem there. And the same thing could be with any sort of transition from one place to another, that being seen as a sort of strategic location for some of these entities to locate themselves at, and then to encounter people who if you're at that bridge, you need that bridge to get from one side to the other or you wouldn't be there. And so finding that vulnerability in a way, and then two, being able to make the transition from one spot to another, that it is symbolic of accomplishing a feat that would otherwise be possibly, not an easy task. For example, just crossing the water. It could be very dangerous without the bridge being there. Or in the case of the train tracks going over the traffic of the highway, couldn't be really done. And I wonder about that with interstates. There's not a lot of talk about the interstates and the highway systems in the United States. But I bet you there's some really strange things going on out there too, with the idea of just the massive traffic and the vastness. If you've ever been on a big road trip, how there is nothing but the road going through huge expanses of land. We have lots of tales about like haunted highways and things like that. So there's something about the vulnerability, and I think that with the bridge, the fact that you need the bridge is why I think it might be a sort of a spot for a lot of this activity to kind of creep up. And I apologize if you can hear my dog behind me, but
No problem.
she's wanting my
Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah, I think we should do it. Maybe next time we can do a couple of shows on roads. I think that'd be good. That'd be a good sort of connection to these episodes here, because there are so many reports of. I think I've even done shows before, going into examples of haunted roads, and yeah, and I mean there's just they're so they do go through all kinds of areas, and some they go through cities where there's all kinds of roads everywhere, but then same with bridges. I wonder too, and whenever it's because you don't see like a bunch of bridges all in one spot. Usually, they're one bridge for however many miles in either direction. Usually, from what I've seen and heard, to where that's the only way to get through a certain area in general, unless you want to go way out of your way to get around it.
right. Yep.
So that makes sense that there be that's the focus of both people and other beings as well, other entities and all of that. So yeah, the I think maybe next time we should do a couple of shows on roads, because that does connect literally and figuratively to what we're talking about here. Also, I wonder too. One of these bridges that I'm finding on these articles here, and I'll share these in the episode description. But there's this bridge in Indiana, Avon Bridge, is said to be haunted by a construction worker who fell into wet concrete there. We've heard that before too. I've heard that in so many other places where the construction of the bridge, there was tragedy that happened during that itself, the making of the bridge.
Right. And that's really weird.
Yeah, and so I've even heard of that, like with major dams, like water dams. I've heard of that. Just any kind of big building where there's concrete and all this other things going on, especially the further back you go in time, to where there wasn't as much safety equipment as there maybe is now. I wonder if that can cause some activity in places as well.
Yeah, the thing with the people passing away and the construction of a place, that whole topic is really interesting because we have like there's the cornerstone idea, like apparently, like when you see in a city where they do the ribbon cutting, they
Yes.
kind of like bring that whole idea. A lot of it, of what I've looked at anyway, it comes around to this idea that they would have like a sort of a cornerstone, and in some cultures, the cornerstone was literally either an animal or a person or something of value of some sort. But typically, in the accounts that I would come across, of course, they were talking about people or animals, and they would be put at the cornerstone basis of what the new building or the new this usually is just a whole town. So I didn't hear about it so much with like a building or anything like that, but a big construct of a town or things like that. In the case of a bridge, it's weird how people in such fervent, trying to do what they can to help the modernity or the progression of what's good for mankind, that sort of thing happens. There are these accidents, but then that person kind of becoming the watchman of that place,
Yes.
which is really weird.
Yep. Yeah, and that could explain why in some cases they're still there is whether they meant to be there or not, or whether that was planned or not, they do want people to be safe, and so they will watch over a place. And even in some rare cases I've heard of where they'll save other people and prevent them
Mhm.
from being hurt as well. I've heard of that too. So
Yeah.
that makes sense too. So
Yeah, the idea of the watchman over the particular areas or the guardianship of properties, I think that that is really strange. And when it comes to bridges and things like that, the theme of either spirits guarding over it or that there's some type of entity, trolls, things like that. There's something really bizarre with that because it's too prevalent not to notice that it might have some kind of significance. But like I say, the reason I think that there are accidents around these bridges is because the location itself poses some type of danger. So that's why they needed the bridge to begin with. And then it sort of becomes a magnet for activity because of the mindset of crossing over that spot. Like to be sitting on a bridge, kind of hanging your feet over moving traffic, you can only do that because of the bridge being there. And then the idea that if a train were to come over it, which is what it was for, there's something kind of exciting about the energy of the bridge. The bridge that I saw the goblin-like figure on. It was kind of a neat place, and kids would go there because of the thrill of it and just kind of walk around on it and that sort of thing. But I do think that there was some reason why that entity or that creature was actually there. And it was probably because people were drawn to it. Not to mention that there was a city and that there would be homeless people who would come along there too sometimes. And so that was really interesting, in a way, because it was sort of out of town, but still in town, in the city. But
right, and I mean, a lot of people when they hear about any kind of goblins or any other of these beings, entities from the past, a lot of people may associate them with just being out in the middle of nowhere. But there's plenty of stories I've heard and accounts of experiences I've heard where no, they're right there in the middle of on the edge or in the middle even of towns and cities and things. So they seem to be, some of them anyway, seem to be able to just, or willing, or want to go and be around all kinds of people in all kinds of places. So so yeah, that's definitely thing. I think the guardianship, and also I think that's probably the more positive side of the whole idea of why these beings are seen at these places. That's sort of the flip side of the negative experience,
yeah,
the negative source. So
I
yeah,
remember seeing paintings when I was growing up. I haven't seen them in a while of what appears to be like it's the concept of the archangel, and it's like two children and they're crossing a bridge, ironically, and like the angel is over them, sort of. And that painting's pretty famous. I don't know who did it, but you can see that sort of idea that a bridge is a vulnerable place. And so anytime you're crossing a bridge of any kind, whether it's through trying to make contact, there's even if you're trying to reach somebody you really need to get in contact with, and say the phone is the bridge, and it starts
right,
to interrupt or breaks down, you no longer can get in contact with that person. That's the bridge. And so the same thing too with people like with the computers and the internet. Like I need to have access to this information or to these individuals, this sort of thing, but say something should happen with that and I can't. That's the vulnerability. Or say you're trying to
right,
get to one location or another and you cannot because maybe the bridge is flooded or it's busted or it's kind of treacherous to go across it. Same idea. So there's a vulnerability with the bridge, and that vulnerability, that's where it must lie in, that there's the significance of why it has some type of power, either symbolically or literal when you come to a bridge, that when you're crossing it, even if it's a peaceful at the moment, there's some type of acknowledgement that you're doing so. Like you said, that there's only so many bridges
yeah,
in a location.
yeah.
I think that was important and interesting too.
Well, that is good. I'm glad that worked out. Thank you for being here again, Jen. We are out of time, and we will talk on another time on Salcedo Paranormal. Thank you for being here.
Thank you too. Have a good night.
You as well, and thank you all for listening. I will talk to you all next time on Salcedo Paranormal. Take care.